Capitalism is a beautiful thing when it comes to keyboards. According to Cherry's own website, the original mechanical X-point, or MX, switch patent expired in 1984. But it wasn't until about 5 years or so that the aftermarket MX switch market gained a reputation for itself as being something more than Cherry clones. Looking at this Geekhack thread from 2015, it's for one of the first Gatoron switch group buys for the Western market, and it's pretty wild to see how far we've come. In the vast history of mechanical keyboard switches, I'd say there were a few switches that helped shape the overall direction of the MX switch market, starting with the MX Black, of course, the ErgoClear, the Zelio, the Holy Panda, the Boba U4T, and the Zyko. As far as for linears, switches like the Tangerine V2 and the Novel Keys Creams, and more recently, switches like the BCP and the Zaku have brought us to the current state of the hobby, where long pull linears are the flavor of the month. Now, you might have listened to the switches I listed as being meta-defining and thought that there were a few switches that were missing. After all, that list wouldn't be complete with at least mentioning the Gatoron Yellow, right? And that's for a very specific reason. Each of the switches listed brought something new to the hobby, from different types of tactility to unique plastics that affected both smoothness and sound. However, there's also a different class of switches that changed the landscape of mechanical keyboards by lowering the cost while increasing quality. From the time most meta switches were first assembled or released, there was a price floor of about 65 cents per switch that was considered the going rate for an aftermarket switch. Anything less than you were in the dreaded Alibaba knockoff China switch price point, with terrible tolerances and even worse shipping times. That unspoken rule remained in place until the venerable Gatoron Yellow came along and destroyed expectations at less than half the price of other aftermarket switches. Were they scratchy? Yes. Did they have abhorrent spring ping? Absolutely. But the Gatoron Yellow was, and still is, one of the best bang for your buck mechanical keyboard switches available. After that came the Alpaca, which offered a premium experience for its time at a price of just 50 cents per switch. JWK came swinging to challenge Gatoron's supremacy as the aftermarket switch king, and some would say they delivered a knockout blow with the Wuque, which brought the quality and smoothness of the Alpaca and its million recolors at a price of just around 30 cents per switch. More recently, newer manufacturers like Texi, Meirun, Haimu, and KTT, among others, have worked to elevate the quality floor to bring higher quality switches at lower prices. I've said this before and I'll say it again. Now is arguably the best time to be getting into the world of mechanical keyboards, because the diversity of options for everything from switches to keycaps to even in-stock keyboards is insane compared to even just a few years ago. And that brings us to today's review, the Wuque Studio WS switch line. Now, if you aren't familiar with Wuque Studio, it's the brainchild of Wuque and C-Keeb, who began Wuque Studio with the goal of making quality keyboards at affordable prices, starting with the Icky 68 and continuing with other unique offerings like the Balance Effortless 1800, the Promise 87, and the Zoom series of keyboards under their Mellatrix line. They were also one of the first designers to work with Umwup in their OA, or Original Aspiration Switch, and lately they've made r/switch modders' dreams come true with their MM series, or Mix and Match series, which lets you mix and match different housings, stems, and springs to customize a switch for your preferences. Next in their growing stable of switches is the WS Red, Yellow, and Brown, which obviously pay homage to some oldies but goodies, the Cherry MX Red and Brown, and the Gatoron Yellow. There are no fancy materials here. All three variants come with a full nylon housing and a palm stem. However, they're a little more than mild sauce on the spicy scale, thanks to a 22mm long 2-stage spring, which leads to a snappy return and a very solid return sound. Interestingly, Wuque Studio flipped the spring weights on the linears, with the WS Red bottoming out at a heavier 67 grams compared to the 53 gram bottom out on the Yellow. That's inverted when looking at my experience with the Cherry MX Red and the Gatoron Yellow, where the red feels significantly lighter than the Yellow does. As for the Browns, they have a listed 55 gram bottom out, but I have to say the tactility on these Browns is pretty special. Here's a quick sound test of all three switches. In actual use, these switches all sounded more mid-heavy than I'd normally expect from a full nylon switch to sound, although that's not necessarily a bad thing. They are all factory lubed, and while I've seen some other reviewers mention that some of their samples seem to be over-lubed or sluggish, I thought the factory lube was pretty consistent. Opening up a switch, you can tell from the brush marks that the lube was brushed onto the stem sliders horizontally, which is odd, but it gets the job done. Another interesting note about the lube was that I couldn't find any lube on the spring, which was interesting because none of the switches I tested had any audible ping or noise. As for the manufacturer, Wuque Studio doesn't list it online, but my best guess based on the type of lube and the two holes in the bottom housing make me believe these could be manufactured by Haimu, as the only other switch that I own where I've seen the two holes is the Haimu Silent series that we reviewed previously. I've reached out to Wuque Studio and I'll pin a comment with their response, but leave your own guesses in the comments below. Sorry, I'm super congested right now. I'm kind of getting over being sick, but I'm getting sick again, I think, but hey, the content never stops. Now, we need to talk about the browns. Hot take, these are a 35-cent Zyko. I was blown away when I put these into a board because the tactile experience is nothing like a Cherry MX Brown, aka the gritty linear. The WS Brown has no pre-travel, a long but sharp tactile event, and technically 1mm of post-travel. Although the tactile bump isn't quite as large as a Zyko, the tactile experience itself is reminiscent of a light switch or popping bubble wrap, just like a Zyko. I say the post-travel is technically 1mm because it feels like it's less in actual typing due to the two-stage spring, which makes the switch return very snappy. And if you're a fan of hyper-tactiles, you need to give these a try. Right after you hyper-tactile that like button. Next, let's go to a sound test in a different board. Today, we're using a prototype of the upcoming Ellipse 60% from Funderburker in top mount configuration with a hot swap PCB and an FR4 plate. Here we go. I actually really like the Ellipse for bringing out the sound differences in the switches, which all share the same housing. Especially when comparing the reds and yellows, it was useful for showing the difference that spring weight can have on your typing experience and subsequently the typing sound. I'm a pretty heavy typist, and the reds were quieter than the yellows as a result of their heavier spring. The differences were way more subtle in the Polaris typing tests, likely because the gasket mount absorbs a lot more of the typing impact than the top mount in the Ellipse. Of course, as a caveat, the Polaris uses a brass plate, which could further affect the sound differences. But that being said, it's time for the good, the bad, and the ugly. First, the good. These switches are almost flawless on every objective metric that I use in my switch reviews. They're smooth and have no crap sounds, crunch, rattle, and ping that are the bane of my existence. Another huge good is the price. At 35 cents per switch, you're getting a better stock experience than both Gatoron and Cherry switches, and the Browns especially are way better than they have any right to be, given their price. These switches feel like they should cost twice as much, and I'm seriously impressed at the overall level of refinement for the price. Now, while there are no objective bads to these switches, I wish the lube application was more precisely done. Now, there wasn't any downside to the horizontally brushed lube from a consistency or feeling perspective that I noticed, but I did notice leakage from the stem legs onto the leaf that I don't think was intentional. I'm sure it helps with smoothness and reducing leaf noise as well, but especially on the Browns, it would be interesting to see if they became more tactile, but also more scratchy without any factory lube. On the other hand, this isn't Wuque Studio's first rodeo when it comes to switch design, and I've always been impressed with their offerings, so maybe they're playing 4D chess while I'm still on checkers. New lube meta technique? Only time will tell, but the bottom line is this. The WS series of switches might be boring, but switches like these are proof of how far the hobby has come in the last few years. 4 years ago, you couldn't buy this stock experience at triple the price. Zelios. And I'm excited to see how much further vendors and designers can bring up the quality while cutting the cost. Check out some more switch reviews here. I'm MakerMods, and I'll catch you in the next video.